The midday sun beat down on my weathered farm hat as I stood by the freshly erected fence, a simple, 4-foot-high barrier of wood and wire. Chickens clucked softly in the background, a symphony of quiet, rural life. But then a screech pierced the air, sharp enough to make the birds scatter. Karen Murphy, the HOA president, stood at my gate, her face a furious crimson, clutching a thick manila folder like a nuclear launch code. "Mr. Peterson!" she shrieked, her voice promising brimstone. "Your fence violates HOA regulations. You must remove it within 72 hours, or be fined $500 per day." She thrust the folder at me with the authority of someone serving a warrant. What she didn't know, however, was that the true wall I was building wasn't on the ground, but in my hands, with every piece of evidence, every legal clause, waiting to be revealed. And she was about to smash her own kingdom with her very own bricks. My name is James Peterson. I'm 52 years old, and after 25 grueling years as a city lawyer, I bought a 5-acre lot in the quiet suburb of Meadowbrook, nestled comfortably outside the bustling city. My plan was simple: retire early, grow my own vegetables, raise chickens, and finally enjoy the peaceful country life I had dreamed of since I was a child. The property was perfect. Enough land to feel secluded, yet close enough to amenities. I envisioned long mornings reading on my porch, the gentle clucking of hens in the coop, and the satisfaction of harvesting fresh produce from my own garden. It was to be a sanctuary, a refuge from the concrete jungle, and the endless legal battles that had defined my professional life. Little did I know, Meadowbrook had its own unique brand of tyranny, personified by 48-year-old Karen Murphy. Karen had been elected president of Meadowbrook's HOA 3 years prior, and in that time she had meticulously woven a web of rules and regulations that controlled every conceivable aspect of suburban life. She controlled everything from house paint colors to grass height in the neighborhood, ensuring a sterile, uniform aesthetic that she deemed perfect. Every neighbor knew Karen had a special talent for finding violations that no one else would even think of, turning peaceful suburban life into a minefield of potential fines and public humiliation. Her word was law, and her presence was a constant, suffocating pressure. I thought I could avoid trouble with the HOA by living far from the main residences, out on the rural edge of the development. My farm was set apart, bordering a small, unpaved road that neighborhood residents commonly used as a walking and biking shortcut to avoid the busy main street. It seemed harmless enough. I didn't want to prohibit anyone from passing through. I just wanted to protect my vegetable garden and chicken coop from the occasional vandal who thought it was funny to let my chickens loose or trample my tomatoes. So I erected a modest fence, 4 feet high, with a simple gate that I kept unlocked during daylight hours. It was a practical, unassuming structure designed for security, not exclusion. Who would have thought that building a simple fence would spark a war that would change this entire neighborhood forever? The first wave of conflict appeared exactly as I described in the hook. Karen knocked on my door one evening, clutching her thick manila folder. "Mr. Peterson," she declared, her voice sharp and accusatory, "your fence violates HOA regulations regarding minimum distance from public walkways." She thrust the folder at me, brimming with self-importance. "You must remove it within 72 hours or you'll be fined $500 per day until compliance is achieved." I was calm. Too calm, perhaps, for someone being threatened with a hefty daily fine. That night I carefully examined my property deed again, cross-referencing it with county records. As a former real estate attorney, reviewing legal documents was second nature to me, a reflex honed over decades. What I found was definitive. That road was entirely within my property boundaries, clearly marked on every official document I owned, dating back decades. It was private land. The next morning, when she returned for my answer, I simply stated, "Miss Murphy, this is private land. I have the right to build a fence." Her face turned the color of a ripe beet, a clear sign that my calm assertion had struck a nerve. "This road has been used by neighborhood residents for over 20 years, she retorted, her voice rising in pitch. "You can't arbitrarily block a public road that serves our entire community." I stood my ground. "It is not a public road, Miss Murphy. It is a private path on my property, and I have the right to protect my property. The conflict escalated dramatically. Karen wasn't used to being challenged, and she certainly wasn't used to being told no by a retired farmer. She began organizing what she called peaceful protests in front of my farm gate. Every morning, at exactly 7:30, she and 4 or 5 neighbors arrived with professionally printed signs reading "Stop Property Abuse" and "Protect Our Rights" in bold red letters. They positioned themselves strategically to block my driveway entrance, forcing me to ask them to move just to leave my own property. Karen would smile sweetly and say, "Of course, Mr. Peterson, we're just exercising our First Amendment rights on public property." Each time I called the police. Officer Martinez came 3 times in the first week, patiently confirming I wasn't violating any laws and politely asking the protesters to move aside for vehicle access. Karen's smug smiles would curdle into tight-lipped scowls as the officer explained that her peaceful protest was, in fact, obstructing traffic on private land. But she didn't give up. She began employing more ruthless tactics that showed her true nature. The third wave of attack came through social media warfare. Karen created an online group called Save Our Neighborhood from Property Bullies, a group that quickly grew to 847 members from surrounding communities, many of whom had never even been to Meadowbrook. Daily, she posted secretly taken photos of me gardening, pruning my tomatoes, or tending to my chickens with inflammatory captions, like "The vandal is expanding his violations," or "This farmer thinks he can do whatever he wants to our community." She would even live-stream from my property line, narrating my activities like a nature documentary about dangerous wildlife. Here we see the property bully in his natural habitat, completely disregarding the rights of hardworking families who just want to enjoy their neighborhood walking path. The psychological warfare intensified as Karen began her campaign to economically isolate me from the community. She systematically contacted every local business, presenting herself as the official representative of concerned citizens. "Mr. Peterson is a threat to our community values," she would tell shop owners, with the sincerity of someone reporting a gas leak. "He's disrupting our peace, ignoring our rules. We believe that businesses should reflect our values." The owner of Henderson's Agricultural Supply, where I'd been buying fertilizer and chicken feed for months, called me with genuine regret in his voice. "I'm terribly sorry, Jim," he said, "but that HOA lady came by with a petition signed by over 100 people. She said, if I continue selling to you, they'll boycott my store and I'll lose half my customer base. I've got employees to think about, you understand." The economic boycott wasn't limited to agricultural supplies. The local hardware store, the feed store, even the coffee shop where I'd enjoyed quiet morning reads, suddenly became unavailable to me. Store owners would look at me with a mixture of sympathy and fear, as if I carried some contagious disease that might infect their businesses. Karen had effectively weaponized the entire local economy against me, turning routine errands into humiliating experiences. But the worst was yet to come. The peak of Karen's arrogance manifested at the monthly HOA meeting in the community center. Word had spread through the neighborhood that this would be the final showdown with the Peterson problem, and the community center was packed beyond capacity. 247 residents filled every chair and lined the walls, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that crackled like electricity before a thunderstorm. Karen had spent the week promoting this as her moment of ultimate vindication, personally calling residents to ensure maximum attendance for what she called the restoration of community order. I arrived 30 minutes early, dressed not in my usual work clothes, but in the charcoal gray suit I'd reserved for the most important court appearances of my career. The transformation wasn't lost on my neighbors, who whispered among themselves about why the farmer suddenly looked like he was heading to a corporate boardroom. I took a seat in the back row, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 25 years' worth of legal expertise, compressed into meticulously organized files. Karen took the podium with the confidence of a general addressing troops before a decisive battle. She had prepared a multimedia presentation, complete with property maps, violation photographs, and what she described as comprehensive documentation of community disruption. She began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. Tonight, we finally resolved the Peterson crisis that has threatened our neighborhood's harmony and property values. I've consulted with our legal team, reviewed all applicable regulations, and prepared a comprehensive enforcement action that will restore proper community standards. The crowd murmured approval as Karen clicked through slides showing my fence from various angles, each image annotated with violations she claimed to have identified. Just as Karen was building to her dramatic conclusion, the community center's main doors opened with theatrical timing. Judge Emily Rodriguez, whom I'd worked alongside for 15 years in various property disputes, entered with 2 court clerks carrying official file boxes. The judge's presence immediately changed the room's energy from neighborhood meeting to formal legal proceeding. "Good evening," Judge Rodriguez announced in her courtroom voice. "I apologize if we're interrupting, but this is the scheduled venue for the official hearing in the matter of Residents versus Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. Are we in the correct location?" The silence that followed was profound enough to hear heartbeats. Karen's confident expression melted into confusion, then concern, then something approaching panic. "Your Honor," she stammered, her voice suddenly small and uncertain, "there must be some scheduling error. This is our monthly community meeting to address internal neighborhood matters." Judge Rodriguez consulted her official calendar with the deliberate care of someone who never makes procedural mistakes. "According to my court records," she stated, 47 residents of this community have filed a formal complaint against the Meadowbrook HOA administration for abuse of power, misappropriation of funds, and violation of residents' property rights. The hearing was specifically scheduled for this date and location at the plaintiff's request. The moment of truth arrived when Judge Rodriguez made her next announcement. The court has appointed attorney James Peterson as the independent legal arbitrator for this proceeding, given his expertise in property law and his status as an affected community member. I stood up from my back row seat, and the sound of 247 people simultaneously drawing breath was audible. Conversations exploded throughout the room as neighbors turned to each other in shock. "Peterson's a lawyer? How did we not know? Is this why he was so calm about everything?" Karen stared at me as if I had spontaneously materialized from another dimension. "Good evening, Miss Murphy," I said, walking toward the front of the room with the measured pace I'd perfected in countless courtrooms. "I believe it's time we had a proper discussion about property law, HOA jurisdiction, and the appropriate use of community funds." The briefcase I opened contained evidence that would systematically dismantle every argument Karen had made over the past months. My first exhibit was the county cadastral map, showing property classifications dating back to 1973. This clearly shows, I explained, the disputed path as crossing private property with no dedicated easement or public right of way. Long-term tolerance of informal use does not create legal entitlement to access. Karen's attorney, Robert Davis, appeared genuinely surprised by this turn of events. He frantically shuffled through his files, clearly unprepared for a formal legal challenge to jurisdiction. "Your Honor," he attempted, "while the property classification may be agricultural, the road in question has been used as a community thoroughfare for over 20 years, establishing precedent for public access. I had anticipated this argument and was ready with a comprehensive response. Mr. Davis, I present the original property survey from 1987, certified by the County Engineering Department. This clearly shows the disputed path as crossing private property with no dedicated easement or public right-of-way. Long-term tolerance of informal use does not create legal entitlement to access." The judge's words fell like hammer blows on Karen's crumbling authority. The courtroom atmosphere intensified when Margaret Chen stood up from the middle of the crowd. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but resolute, "I have evidence regarding the misuse of HOA funds for personal vendettas." She approached the front with a box of financial records that represented months of careful documentation and attestation. "I've been required to process payments totaling $47,000 for legal actions against community members who disagreed with Miss Murphy's decisions. This money was taken from funds designated for community improvements and maintenance. The financial records painted a clear picture of Karen's transformation from community leader to neighborhood dictator, using collective resources to wage personal wars. But the most damaging evidence came in the form of printed email exchanges between Karen and her legal team. Judge Rodriguez read selected excerpts aloud. "Peterson is becoming a threat to my authority," she read. "Find legal justification for forcing compliance, even if we have to interpret regulations creatively." The judge's voice carried the weight of judicial disapproval as she continued reading Karen's instructions. "Make sure the violations sound official and threatening, and to escalate if necessary." Each email was a documented confession of deliberate harassment and abuse of power. The community's reaction was swift and dramatic. Residents who had supported Karen's actions began shifting uncomfortably in their seats as the scope of financial mismanagement became clear. "She spent our playground fund on lawyer fees," one parent called out. "That's why the streetlights haven't been fixed for 2 years," added another voice from the crowd. The murmurs grew into open conversations as neighbors realized they had been funding a personal harassment campaign while their community infrastructure deteriorated. Karen made one final, desperate attempt to maintain control. "This is obviously a coordinated attack," she declared, her voice rising to the shrill pitch that had become her signature during confrontations. "Peterson has obviously bribed Margaret and manipulated the court system to orchestrate this whole spectacle. The real residents of this community know what's right." But her words fell on increasingly hostile ears as the evidence mounted against her. The same neighbors who had voted to isolate me just weeks before were now staring at Karen with the dawning realization that they had been manipulated into supporting financial fraud and legal harassment. Judge Rodriguez's final pronouncement carried the weight of absolute authority. After reviewing the evidence presented, this court finds that the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association has systematically exceeded its legal jurisdiction, misappropriated community funds, and engaged in harassment of residents using intimidation tactics that have no basis in law. Karen Murphy is hereby removed from all HOA positions, effective immediately. She is required to make full restitution of misused funds totaling $47,000 and is permanently barred from holding any elected or appointed position within this homeowners association. The silence in the room was deafening once again, followed by a collective gasp, as Karen Murphy, once the unchallenged neighborhood dictator, was escorted from the community center by her husband. 200 residents watched in stunned silence. Some faces showed satisfaction, others displayed shock at how completely they had been deceived. But everyone understood that the Meadowbrook they woke up to tomorrow would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed that morning. As the crowd slowly dispersed, neighbors approached me with mixtures of apology, curiosity, and gratitude. I knew the real work was just beginning. 6 months after what neighbors now called the night everything changed, Meadowbrook had undergone a transformation that surprised even me. The first major change came when Karen and her family quietly moved away in early December, selling their house to a young military family for 15% below market value. The realtor explained that Karen's reputation had made the property challenging to market within the community, a poetic justice that needed no legal enforcement. Margaret Chen was unanimously elected as the new HOA president, with 198 out of 205 votes, the most decisive electoral victory in the community's history. Her first official action was establishing a Transparency and Accountability Committee that would review all HOA decisions and ensure community funds were used exclusively for legitimate maintenance and improvement projects. The new bylaws, which I helped draft pro bono, transformed the HOA from an authoritarian enforcement body into a genuine community service organization. The changes were immediately visible throughout the neighborhood. Houses began displaying colors and decorations that reflected their owners' personalities rather than Karen's rigid aesthetic standards. Children's play sets appeared in yards without fear of structural violation notices, and gardens bloomed, with vegetables and flowers that had been forbidden under the old landscaping uniformity requirements. My farm became an unexpected community focal point. The disputed road was officially renamed Peterson Trail with my enthusiastic consent, and I expanded it into a proper walking path with rest benches and educational signs about local wildlife and agriculture. Every Saturday morning, I hosted farm school for neighborhood children, teaching them about sustainable gardening, chicken care, and the basics of self-sufficient living. Parents often stayed to help, and these informal gatherings evolved into a weekly community tradition that brought families together in ways the old HOA meetings never had. The economic boycott that Karen had orchestrated against me reversed dramatically once the truth came out. Local business owners, many of whom had reluctantly participated in the isolation campaign, went out of their way to make amends. Henderson's Agricultural Supply offered me a permanent 20% discount and asked if I would teach a weekend workshop on organic farming techniques. The coffee shop where I had been unwelcome created a perfect farm school annex with comfortable chairs and a small library of gardening and legal self-help books. Our story attracted attention far beyond Meadowbrook's boundaries. A journalist from the regional newspaper wrote a feature series called David vs. Goliath, When Communities Fight Back, that was picked up by national media outlets. The articles detailed how legal expertise and community organizing could overcome HOA tyranny, inspiring similar resistance movements across the country. I began receiving emails from residents in dozens of states, sharing their own stories of HOA abuse and asking for guidance on legal challenges. The most rewarding correspondence came from a retired teacher in Arizona whose HOA had tried to prevent her from growing vegetables in her front yard. Using strategies I had outlined in my media interviews, she successfully challenged the restriction and helped establish new community guidelines that prioritized residents' rights over aesthetic control. My own life took an unexpected turn. When I decided to come out of retirement in a limited capacity, working from a converted barn office on my property, I established Community Legal Solutions, a consulting practice specializing in HOA disputes and residents' rights advocacy. The practice operated on a sliding fee scale, ensuring that financial resources wouldn't prevent people from accessing legal guidance when facing neighborhood tyranny. Within months, I was handling cases from across the region, always with the satisfaction of knowing that legal expertise could level the playing field between individual residents and institutional power. The most meaningful change was the transformation of community relationships. Neighbors who had been afraid to express opinions under Karen's regime began participating in local government, attending city council meetings, and advocating for broader municipal reforms. The Meadowbrook experience had taught everyone that democracy requires active participation, and that unchecked authority inevitably leads to abuse. Children who had grown up under HOA restrictions began to understand that rules should serve people, not control them. They learned these lessons not from textbooks, but from watching their neighborhood transform when good people decided to stand up for what was right. And in teaching them, I found the retirement purpose I had never expected, raising a generation that would never again allow tyranny to masquerade as community leadership. The fence that had started our conflict still stood, but now it enclosed, a garden that fed the community rather than dividing it. The final symbol of our transformation was the memorial garden we created where Karen's old protest site had been. Margaret suggested planting vegetables and flowers that neighbors could harvest freely, turning a place of conflict into a source of abundance. The garden's entrance bore a simple wooden sign, "Grown by community, shared by community, protected by justice." Every time I passed that sign, I remember that the most important legal principle isn't found in law books or court decisions, but in the simple truth that people who stand together for what's right cannot be defeated by those who abuse power for personal gain. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice achieved creates lasting change.